Hey guys, Shah here. Today we're going to be taking a look into the Theater of Pain dungeon, doing a full breakdown for you guys. We're going to be taking a look at both the trash mobs and the bosses. There will be timestamps below to skip ahead to the section that you're looking for, but I'm going to break it down by wing, not necessarily the order you have to go in. The cool thing about this dungeon is that while it is linear, it's not necessarily a scripted path that you have to take. There are separate wings that you can go to depending on your own group's preference or composition, to maximize not only your cooldowns, but also your defensives as well. So I'm going to be breaking down all those mobs, some of the priority targets, and how to do each boss fight. So let's just dive right in. So to start things off, you're going to start in the upper floor of the Theater of Pain, or I guess the ground floor, where you're eventually going to descend into the dungeon to face different wings and different bosses of all different types of aesthetics, to clear the rest of the dungeon to eventually come up victorious and face off against the Theater of Pain champion. So as you enter the dungeon or you slot your key, you're going to face off against two different packs that can be pulled together. This will contain a Battlefield Ritualist, a Raging Bloodhorn, and two unyielding contenders. The Battlefield Ritualist will cast Necrotic Bolt, and this is just basic magic damage with a heal absorb tied to it. The Battlefield Ritualist will also cast Unholy Fervor, which will essentially just heal it for a percentage of its maximum health, so you're going to want to make sure you're kicking this mob at all costs. The unyielding contenders cast Vicious Strike, which is just a tank buster ability. Tanks are just going to want to mitigate this damage, and they also cast Death Wish, which is just a damage increase, which can be soothed. Lastly, the Raging Bloodhorn, if decided to be pulled in with this, will just cast one spell called Raging Tantrum. This will deal physical damage to all enemies during its channel. Fun note, druids and hunters are able to tranquilize this or soothe this target, and it will stop its channel. But if you do not have a druid or a hunter with you who can soothe this effect, you'll want to prepare some kind of damage reduction abilities tied to this, because in a high fortified key, it can yield a lot of damage. Going into the next boss, Affront of Challengers, you're not going to need as many defensive cooldowns, as the damage is kind of more or less avoidable, but also more sporadic, and there's no point where you're going to be taking a lot of damage as a group. So making sure you can get some of these early mobs down quickly is going to result in a more successful run. Now the first boss is called Affront of Challengers, and honestly, even after like 20 attempts at this dungeon, I have still yet to actually know what they do, but I'm going to do my best here to break it down. It's one of those weird bosses where it's more of a council fight, but they don't feel like they have any significant abilities that they do, and they kind of do them at random times. So this feels more like a glorified trash pack, but we're going to break down exactly what each of these mobs are going to be doing during the encounter. So during this encounter, you'll actually have four mobs to deal with. And these four mobs names are Desia the Decapitator, Pakarin the Virulent, and Sathel the Accursed. And then lastly, we have Zira the Underhanded. Zira the Underhanded is only going to come up in the Mythic encounter, but I'm assuming that most of you guys are looking at this video to do Mythic Plus or some type of harder content. So if you're not doing Mythic, obviously ignore this one. So during the fight, Desia the Decapitator is going to do a couple tank buster abilities, which is going to be Slam and Mortal Strike, similar to what warriors do. Mortal Strike is going to actually reduce the healing that the tank takes, and Slam is just going to be doing a lot of physical damage to the target. Now, obviously, you're going to want to mitigate during the time that she's tanking, but during the encounter, she's actually going to Enrage. And Enraging is going to give her an absorption shield, which is equal to 30% of her maximum health. Now, while she's enraged, she's going to move slower, and this mob, or I guess this part of the boss fight, is going to fixate on random players at certain times, chasing them down. So you can soothe the Enrage to have her get rid of the absorption shield, but she's going to be able to chase your ally at full speed. So you're going to want to be wary of this. We have Pakaran as well, and he's going to just generically cast Plague Bolts, which is going to just do some plague damage to a random player. You also have Noxious Spores, which is a zone that is going to actually create an area of denial, which will inflict plague damage if you stand in it. And on Mythic difficulty, it's actually also going to slow players as well who run through this. So if you are being chased by Desia, you're going to want to make sure you're avoiding the Noxious Spores zones. And then as a healer mechanic, Genetic Alteration. While players are affected by this, they will end up actually dropping the Noxious Spores near their current location every few seconds, every 8 seconds actually. So you're going to want to make sure you're dropping this in probably near the center of the room, since you want to keep the edge of the room clear. And then lastly, you have Sathel the Accursed. He's going to cast random necromantic bolts at players, and he'll eventually become one with death. Once he becomes one with death, he will absorb damage equal to his health, and he'll become immune to interrupts. So while he isn't immune to interrupts, you're going to want to make sure you're kicking him just to reduce some damage. And once he becomes immune, making sure you're breaking through that shield. He will also cast Searing Death at random players as well. And if you are afflicted by Searing Death, you want to make sure you are spreading out. While you have this, you're going to, every couple seconds, you're going to afflict damage to every player within 3 yards of you. So again, like I said, spreading out is going to be the key to this fight. Spectral Transference is the last ability that he'll cast. And when he does this, the damage that he does will actually trigger a heal on his marked targets. So you want to make sure you're interrupting him as much as possible. This will probably be the kill priority. So out of all 3 mobs, you obviously want to maximize your cleave, but make sure you are targeting Sathel. And then lastly, like I mentioned, Zero will also come into the arena every once in a while. And she is an uninterruptible mob, which will cast Opportunity Strikes at a random player. This will typically target a DPS or a healer and will never really target the tank, at least in the testing that I have done. So essentially, this is similar to how the snakes worked in Temple of Sethralis during Mordretha's boss encounter. And what you're going to want to do is as soon as a target gets stunned by her, you're going to want to stun Zira or use some kind of CC effect on Zira to make her stop the Opportunity Strikes, and then after that she will go away. So it's essentially just a random stun you're going to want to keep track of. But that's pretty much how Affront of Challenger fights. Now, it sounds like a lot of different mechanics going on, but honestly, I found the best way to do this is just to cleave them all down and to interrupt what you can, and you'll typically be fine. Now, there will probably be some kind of strategy. This fight does get a little obnoxious, though, because the mobs, I guess the mobs, or the different bosses in this encounter tend to kind of spread out in a very awkward way because some are casters, some are melee, and then random people getting stunned by Zira just make the fight a little bit of a clusterfuck. So that's the fight as best as I can explain it. So once you defeat Affront of Challengers, which is the first boss, you're gonna descend into the dungeon, and you're gonna have to take on 3 different wings. These don't have to be done in any particular order, and they have a nice cyclical pattern, so you don't have to run the whole hallway and then come back. Essentially, once you defeat a boss, you're gonna have easy access to return to the Chamber of Conquest. Going in no particular order, we're going to start with the Halls of Might. The entrance to this chamber is going to be to the south, if you are looking at your mini-map. The first thing you're going to approach in here is a Shambling Arbalest. This mob is randomly going to shoot the tank, as well as other party members, as well as apply Jagged Coral, which is a physical damage dot. You're going to just want to make sure this person is receiving a healthy amount of heals. Along with this, you're also going to have to verse 2 ossified conscripts. Honestly, these guys don't do much. All they do is really melee, so tanks are just going to want to make sure you're mitigating this while focusing the Arbalest. This wing is kind of interesting because it has a fairly RNG pattern in which mobs you have to face. There's going to be 3 duels going on, and as you approach these mobs who are dueling, one is going to come out victorious, and that is the one that you're going to have to face. Now, in the very first round, you have 2 possible opponents. This will be Nekthara, the Mangler, or Dokig, the Brutalizer. The first one, Nekthara, will cast 3 different abilities. Actually, all of these mobs will have 3 different abilities. Some of them are going to be repeated between the 2, and knowing which ones do which are going to help you counter these. Nekthara will cast a Whirlwind, which is a centered AoE around the mob. You'll just want to avoid this at all costs. It will also do a targeted AoE with a Whirling Blade. Typically, this will be targeted at ranged players. You'll just want to avoid this at all costs. And lastly, there's a ability called Interrupting Roar. This ability is an AoE disrupt, so don't get caught casting, or you'll be interrupted and spell locked for a few seconds. I would say that Nekthara is the better of the 2. The other mob that you might have to face, or the other champion you might have to face, is called Dokig the Brutalizer. He does a more of a tank buster ability called Savage Flurry, and this is a bunch of repetitive brutal strikes, which will hit pretty hard. You will have downtime between each Savage Flurry that the healer or yourself will be able to top you off, but as a tank player, you're going to want to make sure you're using some sort of cooldown during this specific mob. He will also cast Battle Trance, which can be interrupted, but if it does get off for any reason, it will give him a hastened damage buff. And then lastly, he will cast Brutal Leap, targeting typically a ranged player, and this will create an Area of Denial or an AoE effect that once his cast finished, he will jump to that targeted location. Moving forward, you're going to actually face a second round of champions pretty much right off the bat, or coming right out of our last little duel. And this champion can either be Harugla the Bloodthirsty or Heaven the Breaker. Harugla will cast 3 different abilities. Bloodthirsty Charge. This is going to be an avoidable AoE you're just going to want to move out of. She will also cast Ricocheting Blade. This ability will essentially be force targeted on a player. That player will need to move away from other players. If not, it's a Ricocheting Blade, so it's going to bounce to all targets within the circle. And then lastly, she will cast Battle Trance. Similar as we saw before, you're going to want to interrupt this. And if it does get off, you're going to want to soothe it. If you are the tank and this does get off and you have none of those options, you're going to want to use some kind of defensive here because she's going to have increased haste and damage. The other option or not the other option, but the other contender that you might see here is having the Breaker. He does Colossus Smash, which is more or less of a tank buster. Interrupting Roar, which is something that we've already seen. Just make sure you're not casting during this. And then Ground Smash. This is going to be a frontal cone AoE. You're going to want to avoid this at all costs to avoid unnecessary damage. Now, between the next pair of champions, you're going to have to face a Patrol, which contains 5 mobs. It contains an Ancient Captain, which will cast Demoralizing Shout. You're going to want to kick this, or you're going to be doing reduced damage to all of the targets. You're also going to see 2 more ossified conscripts and 2 more shambling arbalests. Again, the arbalests, they just shoot and they apply physical damage debuff, and the conscripts really don't do anything besides melee. So tank, just make sure you're keeping up your active mitigation and healing the damage that you need to. And then completing this patrol, you're going to face your last round of champions. This will either be Wreck the Hardened or Advent Nevermore. Now, if you verse Wreck, he is going to cast Swift Strikes, which is going to be increased attack speed plus a cleave to any nearby allies. So you're going to want to distance yourself away from any other melee players, and if you're range, you're going to make sure you're not in melee. He'll also cast Whirlwind, which conveniently enough, because you don't want to really be in melee anyways, you're just going to want to not stand in this centered AoE around the character's model. And then lastly, he's going to do Unbalancing Blow. Now, this is a 100% block, dodge, and parry debuff reduction. So as a tank player, you're going to want to make sure you're mitigating during this time, because you're not going to be able to use your passive defensives of block, dodge, and parry. And if you get lucky enough, you'll have to verse Advent Nevermore, which is the other champion that you might have to verse here, which will cast Ricocheting Blade, which is something that we've already seen. Seismic Stomp, which is just unavoidable group damage, and then Unbreakable Guard. Unbreakable Guard, she will face a random party member, and she's going to basically channel an Invulnerability Shield, which will be the front 180 degrees of the character. Everyone's going to just want to move behind the boss model. So not too much to do here. Most people can typically stay in melee, except for the Ricocheting Blade player is going to want to step out of melee. And then after this, you're going to be moving on to the boss, Xav the Unfallen. So at the end of this wing, you'll approach Xav the Unfallen, and he does a few different tank buster abilities. So he has Brutal Combo, and if you are not healthy, you're going to want to make sure you're using a cooldown for this, because on a higher Tyrannical Keys especially, this is going to do an insane amount of heavy physical damage. Randomly throughout the fight too, Xav will perform multiple avoidable attacks during the Might of Maldraxxus, where he'll jump to the center of the room and start doing random different cleave or frontal cone abilities. Players are just going to want to dodge this in general, and then as he spawns Oppressive Banners, these will slow your movement speed every couple seconds while it is alive, and you're going to want to make sure you're getting this down. Now, the issue with this is the Oppressive Banner is typically going to be down while 2 players are fighting in the arena, and you're going to be down 2 DPS. So this banner doesn't have a lot of health, but it's going to take the healer, tank, and the remaining DPS to make sure this gets down, so you're able to dodge the Might of Maldraxxus. Now, when Xav reaches maximum energy, which is 100, he's going to force 2 players into the dueling pit below, and the winner of this is going to be granted Glorified, while the loser is affected by Bloodied. During this arena fight, the 2 players are going to have to duel. The winner is going to have a damage buff, and the loser is going to have a damage decrease. Blizzard has done a lot of tuning in the last couple patches with this, and the damage is actually all the way down to only 10% damage reduction and 10% damage increased. So who really wins this doesn't really matter. Honestly, you just want to get out of this player as fast as possible. And if neither player is actually defeated within 45 seconds, both players are going to be affected by Cowardice, which is essentially going to just be a damage reduction debuff that's going to be applied to both of the 2 players who decided not to duel. So when you get sent down there, most groups will probably try to coordinate who is going to win and who's going to lose based on cooldowns. But at the end of the day, you're going to just want to get out of this pit as fast as possible, because the Oppressive Banners need to be dealt with. When coming back up, you do want to be careful of the Might of Maldraxxus, because that combination can get pretty deadly if you get hit by something. So you're going to want to coordinate with your group when this is going off, or you're going to want to pay attention to boss timers. Lastly, healers just want to be ready to be moving, because during the Might of Maldraxxus and the brutal combos, you're going to want to make sure you're healing the tank as well as dodging abilities from the Might of Maldraxxus. This boss is pretty straightforward though, not much to it. Once you defeat him, you're actually able to just jump off the ledge below and run up to the next wing. The next zone that we're going to talk about is Altars of Agony. This is going to be the northmost path, or if you're leaving the Halls of Might, this is going to be the stairs to the right. The first thing you're going to have to do here is a small gauntlet with a lot of mobs called Shackled Soul. Now, what these Shackled Souls do is that they will cast Bind Soul at a random party member. This is a channeled cast that can be interrupted, but essentially it'll reduce your movement speed, which can be an issue because this gauntlet has a lot of little area of denial or little AoE swirls that you're going to want to dodge and avoid, or it does a fair bit of damage. They also cast Soul Touch at a random target. This is just going to be a random spell damage that you can avoid just by making sure you're kicking or disrupting in some form or fashion. So there's 2 different strategies to this. You can either try to mount up and run all the way through the hallway to try to mass pulleys and stack them up next to each other. Or what I like to do, at least what I have been doing on beta, is I actually will pull about half of the pathway back out of the room so we don't have to worry about dodging squirrels. and you get a nice little line of sight area, and then you would finish that same thing by pulling the rest of the mobs through to the next area. So once this is complete, you're going to face off against one Portal Guardian. This Portal Guardian will apply a curse to a player. This can't be interrupted because it's an instant cast, but this will want to be dispelled. It's very similar to how the Elemental Guardian worked in Shrine of the Storm. You're going to want to make sure that curse is dispelled before it starts casting Soulstorm. Soulstorm is an AoE shadow damage that will affect everyone within 60 yards. If you don't have access to a curse spell in your group, like a Shaman, Mage, or Druid, you're going to want to make sure that that player is using a defensive cooldown of some sort, or that a damage reduction cooldown is used on said player. Now, once the Portal Guardian dies, is going to be a common theme for the rest of the place, is it's going to drop an orb, and that orb is going to be used to pick your path, which is what is really cool about this wing. You can either go left or right by placing the orb in the pedestal, and then you're going to take the gate. Now, make sure you're not clicking on the orb on accident, and if you do happen to pick it up after someone's gone through the portal, make sure you put it on the same side, because depending on which side you put the orb will take you a different route. Now, because there are different routes here, I'm mainly just going to show you some footage of different pulls in the dungeon and talk about some of the mobs you might run into. First, if you decide to go right, for example, you're going to run to a Nefarious Darkspeaker. Now, what this mob does is it's going to cast Spirit Frost, which is just a random targeted damage ability. You're going to just want to kick this at all costs. It's also going to cast Death Winds. Now, Death Winds is a frontal knockback after a short cast. Now, you're going to want to make sure you're dodging this at all costs because it will knock you off any platform that you are on, which can lead to your demise. Lastly, it'll cast Curse of Desolation. Again, this is a curse dot, and this will fear anyone within 3 yards, as well as doing damage to all nearby allies. So if you have a curse spell, make sure that player is out of the group and dispel them. If you do not have a curse spell, just make sure you're spreading out effectively while also dodging Death Winds. So as you go to the next platform, you're going to see a few different mobs as well. You're going to see another Portal Guardian, which I've already covered, and then as well as that, you're going to see a Manacle Soulbinder. And this Soulbinder casts very similar things that we saw in the Necrotic Wake, which was my last dungeon video that I did. You're going to see Necrotic Bolt and Necrotic Bolt Volley. Now, the Volley you're going to want to kick at all costs. This is going to be the priority for your group to make sure you lock down. Necrotic Bolt, if you can lock it down, great. If not, just make sure you're going to have a kick up for the Volley, because the Volley will do a lot more damage in a lot shorter time. As well as this, you're going to see Bone Magus. They cast Bone Spear, which is just physical damage. And then you're going to see Grave Spike, which is actually going to be physical damage plus a knockback. So you're going to want to make sure no casters or melee are stacked up, because the knockback can do a fair bit of damage, which can offset your group's pace and put you in an uncomfortable situation, especially paired with a Nefarious Darkspeaker. Now, the last thing that you're going to see in here is going to be a Soulforged Bone Reaver. Now, similar to the boss models that we've seen before, this guy will cast Bone Spikes, which is just a channeled AoE. Make sure you're dodging this. As a caster, it's a little bit more annoying. Just make sure you're prioritizing kicks at this point and making sure you're staying alive at all costs. And then lastly, it will cast Bone Storm. This is just going to be an AoE damaging ability that you're going to want to make sure you use a damage reduction for. So once you complete the various platforms, you're going to head up to Kul'tharok, which is a very, very interesting boss fight that a lot of people still don't know how they work, but I'm going to break it down right now. Kul'tharok was a boss that when I first started testing, I was absolutely frustrated with, because he did an insane amount of damage to the group because no one really knew what to do. So I'm hoping this quick breakdown kind of helps you. Now, this boss is not able to be moved. He will stay stationary in the middle of the room. And if you run, he will just start casting bolts at you. So just make sure you're in melee range at all times as a tank player. The tank really doesn't have to worry too much about what's going on in this fight, and this fight is going to mainly rely on the healers and the DPS to make sure they're minimizing group damage. So the big thing here is going to be the Draw Soul mechanic. Now, while the Draw Soul mechanic is being channeled, you're going to want to move into the Grasping Hands that's on the ground. This Grasping Hand will actually keep your soul in position as a DPS player or a healer, so you can walk back into it. So Draw Soul will come out, and you're going to want to be in these hands. Once the cast finishes, you're going to be stunned for a brief second, and then you're going to have to run over your soul. Now, if you didn't make it to the Grasping Hands in time, you're going to have to chase your soul around, and as your soul persists, it's going to do AoE damage to the entire group. While this is going on, Kul'tharok will also cast out 2 Phantasmal Parasites. Now, this does a fair bit of damage to the target, so you're going to want to make sure you're putting a healthy amount of heals into them. This is dispellable, so you're going to want to make sure you dispel at least one of these as soon as possible. Other classes with dispels, like if you're running a Dwarf Racial of some sort, if you have an Imp Dispel as well, or if you're a Priest with Mass Dispel, you can help clear these, because this is where most of the damage in the fight is going to come from. The Phantasmal Parasite not only does damage to the player inflicted with it, but also all players within 3 yards of the target, every second for 10 seconds. So making sure this is being dispelled at the appropriate times is going to help minimize group damage. Now, you do want to be careful, because if Draw Soul goes out and you have Phantasmal Parasite on you, you want to probably make sure you're getting Dispel or calling for a Dispel of some sort, or using a personal defensive. The big mechanic for the tank is called Spectral Reach. Essentially, this will only go off if you're not in melee range, so making sure you're just staying in melee range is going to be the best solution to not getting hit by this. The big thing for healers on this fight is that Chill to the Bone is just an aura that Kul'tharok puts out. His presence actually chills every player, inflicting just shadow damage every 3 seconds. So this is really a healer fight when it comes down to it, and making sure DPS players are minimizing the damage that they're taking by properly not having their soul drawn out without being in the hands. Now there is one odd overlap currently. I'm not sure if this is a bug or not, but it's been in the game for a few weeks where the third set of hands actually doesn't spawn until after draw soul goes out. The healer needs to use a cooldown while the DPS or healer need to try to pick up their soul. Outside of that, the boss isn't too complicated. It's really just a healing throughput fight and making sure you're executing some of the mechanics properly. All right, last but not least, you have the Barrow of Carnage, which is going to be the westmost wing that you're going to be able to go to. There's a few interesting mobs in here, and a lot of this is going to be like poison and disease damage that you're going to want to make sure you keep under control by using kick priorities and dispels. First things first, you're going to see a diseased horror. This casts 2 different things. Decaying Strike is going to be applied to the tank. This is a disease debuff that can be dispelled, and essentially what it does is it's going to, while it's active on the tank or any player that had aggro on it at the time, it's going to do poison damage, or I guess disease damage over time, and it's going to be a 20% max health reduction. So dispelling this as soon as possible is going to be key. And then it's also going to cast Meat Shield. This is going to be a damage absorb, and the longer it channels for, the more the damage absorb is going to be up for. So you're going to want to make sure you kick this almost instantly if possible. Assigning a player to kick this will be probably in your best interest. Next, we're going to see a lot of disgusting refuses. Mainly what these guys do is just jump around and do random like group damage or cleave damage to whatever target they're jumping towards. There's a few ways to deal with this through like things like Ursul's Vortex, Mass Grip, stuns, and keeping them locked down with different types of disorients. But for the most part, you're going to want to lightly stack up and cleave as much as possible. Outside of that, there's not much that these guys do, but they're going to be paired with the Blighted Sludge Spewer. They're the elite mobs of this pack, and essentially what they do is they'll cast every few seconds. They'll try to cast Withering Discharge, which is an AoE disease that's going to make you take a lot of damage, but it's also going to reduce the damage you do and the healing you do by 20% per stack. So if this gets any more than 1, it's going to be a very, very difficult for anyone to do anything. Now, having a lot of diseases spell in this wing is going to help your group, but if any player is going to get hit with this, I recommend dispelling the tank for aggro or dispelling the healer so they can keep you alive during the damage. Now for the rest of the dungeon, you're going to see kind of a combination of diseased horrors and the Blighted Sludge Spewers, and we're going to also see Putrid Butchers, and these do a kind of a generic chop ability, which is going to just hit the tank for some physical damage, but they're also going to cast Devour Flesh, and this is going to heal that caster. It's going to heal the Putrid Butcher back for the amount of damage that it deals. So as a tank player, making sure you're going to mitigate or use some type of cooldown during this is going to minimize the health and the healing that the Putrid Butcher will do during this cast. So making sure you're mitigating or kiting during this cast is going to be vital for getting through this key as smoothly as possible. Last but not least, you're going to see a Rancid Gas Bag, which this mob will cast Vile Eruption, which is like an hourglass AoE. It's something that we don't see too often in the any kind of dungeon, actually. So essentially what you want to do is you want to avoid being both in front and behind him, because if you get hit by this, it'll do a fair bit of damage, and it will disorient you for a few seconds. And as a tank player getting hit by this, the Rancid Gas Bag is going to start mailing random players, and if you're a healer, you're obviously not going to be able to do any kind of healing. Now, the Rancid Gas Bags actually have an aura as well that they put out to all players within a certain radius of it. And what the Disease Plague Cloud does is it just does ticking damage while you're within range. And this can even happen after the mob has died. So you want to make sure you kill this and then move away from the mob as fast as possible. Throughout this whole wing, you're going to see different combinations of a few of these before getting to Gorechop, which is the boss of this wing. And if you go in the order that I've done this video, this will be the penultimate boss before you get up to the top, but I'm going to cover Gorechop's abilities right now. Gorechop is definitely one of my favorite fights in here, but definitely one of the more frustrating ones. The fight is fairly simple. Most players are going to want to stand in melee during this encounter, and the reason why is because the big mechanic here is going to be tenderizing Smash, and what he's going to do is he's going to pull all players into him and smash the ground, inflicting damage. This is going to overlap with the meat hooks that are on the wall. So staying in melee is going to not put you in a position where you're kind of disoriented, and it's on the tank to make sure that Gorechop is in the right position. Also, being in melee helps you stack up so the mobs that are spawning during the fight aren't running all over the place, and the tank can easily grab aggro on them. The tank is going to want to watch out for the Hateful Strike that's going to come up from Gorechop. Just make sure you're using defensives here. It's going to do a lot of physical damage, so making sure you have your active mitigation and rotating your defensive properly is going to help mitigate this damage. Now, the meat hooks are kind of the most recognizable mechanic of this fight. Meat hooks are going to spawn on either side of the wall. There's going to be a few openings, And you're going to want to make sure you're dodging and weaving through these openings so you're not getting caught. If you get caught, you're going to be affected by Jagged Gash, and this is going to do an insane amount of bleed damage over its duration. I can imagine in higher key levels that this is going to do an insane amount of damage, and I'm not sure yet if it's scaling with Fortified or a Tyrannical setting. In BFA, we saw a lot of instances where certain boss mechanics were actually scaled with Fortified and not Tyrannical because, you know, Blizzard coding. And then the last big part of this fight is every about 20 to 30 seconds or so, he's going to spawn ads. Essentially, every time the meat hooks come down, ads are going to spawn, and they're going to just keep jumping at players and leaping at them. They're going to cast Leaping Thrash, which again targets a random enemy, doing some physical damage, and they will also coat the ground in ooze once they die. So making sure that you're rotating around the room, avoiding these pools are going to minimize the damage that the group is going to be taking. The nice thing about these mobs is that they slowly kill themselves over time. They lose 5% of their maximum health every 1 second. So even if you can't get aggro on them, they will eventually die, but trying to maintain threat is going to help you minimize the damage that the rest of the group is going to be taking. A lot of this falls on the tank, making sure they're rotating through their taunts and rotating through their damaging abilities, making sure that they're holding aggro. And I can't stress this enough, standing in melee makes this fight so much easier because you're not going to be gripped all over the place and you're going to have your bearings when the meat hooks come down from the wall. This is a rinse and repeat fight. It's just going to keep happening over and over again until you finally finish Gorechop. Now, if you went through the dungeon in this particular order and you've killed all 4 of the bosses, you're actually going to be done with the dungeon and you're going to head up back to the Theater of Pain to face off against Mordretha, the Endless Empress, which is the final boss of the dungeon. Now, she has a lot of very interesting mechanics that I'm going to try to dissect as easily as possible or as best I can. So I found that the best place to typically tank her is the center of the room because it will give the DPS the most amount of space to work with during a lot of these mechanics. Now, the first thing that she's really going to do is Dark Devastation. Dark Devastation is a frontal cone which is going to target a random player and start spinning clockwise or counterclockwise, doing a pushback. The thing about this is getting hit by this does a lot of damage every 0.5 seconds, but on top of that, it could push you out of the room, getting hit by the NPC mobs on the outside of the dungeon who will throw you back in, also doing damage. So this can easily lead to your demise. So avoiding Dark Devastation is going to be your best bet at staying alive during this fight. Now, a few other things that it does is the tank is going to want to make sure that they are mitigating themselves during Reaping Scythe. Reaping Scythe just does a lot of physical damage and shadow damage. So it has 2 parts of it. So a lot of this physical damage can be mitigated, but the shadow damage is going to avoid your armor. So you're going to want to make sure you're rotating through some of your defensives, calling for damage reductions, or countering this with some type of healing of some sort. The big mechanic here is actually going to be called Grasping Rift. Now what she does is she tears open a rift that draws all the players towards it for 6 seconds. Players that are pulled into the Grasping Rift are going to be affected by Death Grasp, and this is going to stun you and making you unable to move or attack or do any kind of damage since you're stunned for 8 seconds. Now, this can be very, very devastating when it's paired with Echoes of Carnage. So Echoes of Carnage is going to spawn random echoes, which will do damage in different patterns. There's two patterns to these. There's the Echo of Battle, which are going to have some contenders battling, and they're going to erupt after a few seconds, doing a lot of shadow damage to everyone caught within 8 yards of this. You're also going to have Ghostly Carnage. You're also going to have Ghostly Charge, and it's going to be Ghost Riders charging across the arena, doing shadow damage to anyone caught in their path and getting them knocked back. Now, in a higher key setting, this will one-shot you if you're hit by any of these combatants, so you're going to want to make sure you're avoiding these. Now, this won't happen until she reaches 50% health and just makes the fight harder, so it's a latter half. There are some groups that like to hold hero for the second half, but it's totally up to you how you want to do this fight. The other big thing is with Grasping Rift is that she will also apply Manifest Death on targets. Now this, what it does is it puts a debuff on all the players, haunting them, doing damage over a few seconds. When this expires, it's going to do burst damage to all allies caught within 6 yards, and then on a mythic difficulty, this effect will also spawn Deathwalkers. Deathwalkers are just going to cast Death Bolt, doing random shadow damage at randomly targeted party members, and you're going to want to interrupt these and get these as grouped up as possible. They are susceptible to stuns, CCs, knockbacks, and movement impairing effects, as well as kicks. So getting these stacked up is going to be really nice. Death Knights are going to have an easy time with this. Like a Kyrian Paladin is going to have an easier time with this as well, being able to silence all the mobs. So the idea is during Grasping Rift and Manifest of Death, you're going to want to stack up as close as possible without cleaving each other and getting each other killed, because you want these to be as close as possible to cleave. Like I said, this fight gets a lot harder as it goes, and a lot of these different mechanics have different overlaps between Grasping Rift, Echoes of Carnage, and Manifest of Death, as well as Dark Devastation. So making sure you're paying attention to all of these during different parts of the encounter are going to help you be successful. But that's pretty much it. Once Mordretha goes down, the dungeon is over. If you happen to miss percent, you can descend back into the dungeon if you need to, but you should make sure you have 100% trash before you come up, because that's just, you're killing time if you come up and waste that time. So Going linear through most of these different wings are going to get you the most amount of trash possible. Now, however you want to optimize your route is totally up to you and your group. But I hope this guide helps, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you think. Let me know what dungeon you'd like to see next, and I will catch you all in the next one. Take care.